The next evening started like any other at Le Maison d'Or. Marcus arrived early for his shift, the autumn sun already setting behind Manhattan's tall buildings. As he changed into his crisp white shirt and black vest in the staff room, he noticed an unusual tension in the air. Mrs. Reynolds was rushing around more than usual, checking and double-checking every detail in the dining room. The crystal glasses seemed to sparkle even more tonight, and fresh flowers had been placed on every table. Something was different, but Marcus couldn't quite figure out what. "Make sure every table has the gold-rimmed plates tonight," Mrs. Reynolds instructed, her voice slightly shaky. "And Marcus, please take extra care with tables 14 through 16 in the private section." She adjusted her blazer nervously, something Marcus had never seen her do before. The first few hours of service went smoothly. Marcus served wealthy couples and business executives with his usual professional grace, though he couldn't help but notice several men in dark suits discreetly walking through the restaurant, speaking into their earpieces. At exactly 8:30 p.m., a buzz of excitement swept through the staff. Robert, the senior server, rushed past Marcus, whispering, "He's here. The new owner is here." Marcus tried to get a glimpse of the entrance, but the host's stand blocked his view. The maitre d', James, suddenly appeared beside Marcus. "You'll be serving table 15 tonight," he said, his face unusually serious. "Remember, absolute professionalism is required." Marcus nodded, wondering why everyone was acting so strange about one guest. As Marcus approached table 15 with his water pitcher, he noticed a small group being seated. The lighting in this section was dimmer than usual, and he could only make out silhouettes at first. There were 4 Secret Service agents standing nearby, but Marcus was too focused on his task to think about why they were there. Then he heard that distinctive voice, one he had heard many times on television, but never expected to hear in person. Marcus almost dropped his water pitcher as he realized who was sitting at his table. Donald Trump, dressed in his signature dark suit and red tie, was settling into his chair. Marcus's hands began to shake slightly. He had spent countless hours criticizing Trump's policies on social media and in conversations with friends. Just last week, he had attended a protest against one of Trump's business developments in the city. And now, here he was, about to serve him dinner. Trump was accompanied by 3 other guests, all in expensive business attire. They were discussing a new real estate project, their voices low but animated. Marcus approached the table, his professional training kicking in despite his personal feelings. "Good evening," Marcus managed to say, his voice steadier than he felt. He began pouring water for the table, trying to avoid direct eye contact with Trump. As he poured, he couldn't help but notice Trump's familiar golden hair and commanding presence. Sarah, another server, passed by and gave Marcus a meaningful look. She mouthed something that looked like, "Be careful," but Marcus was too focused on not spilling water to understand why. The restaurant's usual buzz seemed to fade into the background as he concentrated on this unexpected situation. Trump looked up at Marcus with a friendly smile, completely unaware of the internal struggle this server was experiencing. "We'll need a wine list," Trump said in his characteristic New York accent, "and make sure it includes your best American wines." Marcus nodded stiffly and turned to fetch the wine list. As he walked away, his mind was racing. He had no idea that Trump was the restaurant's new owner, the mysterious buyer everyone had been talking about. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. He had finally landed his dream job at an upscale restaurant, only to find out it was owned by in the service station. Marcus took a deep breath. He had 2 choices. He could provide the professional service Le Maison d'Or was known for, or he could let his personal feelings affect his work. As he grabbed the leather-bound wine list, his decision would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. The elegant Le Maison d'Or restaurant stood proudly in the heart of Manhattan, its golden exterior catching the last rays of the setting sun. Inside, Marcus Chen adjusted his black bow tie for the 3rd time that evening, staring at his reflection in one of the restaurant's many ornate mirrors. At 26 years old, he had finally landed what many considered the most prestigious serving position in New York City. The restaurant's interior sparkled with crystal chandeliers that hung from gold-leaf ceilings, casting a warm glow over the deep burgundy walls. White tablecloths draped perfectly over each table, and silverware gleamed under the careful attention of the staff. Marcus took pride in working in such a beautiful place, even though he had only been there for 3 weeks. Chen, table 7 needs fresh napkins, called out Robert, the senior server who had been working at Le Maison Dior for over 15 years. Marcus quickly grabbed crisp, white napkins from the service station and hurried to assist. As he worked, Marcus couldn't help but overhear two other servers discussing the recent change in the restaurant's ownership. "I heard the new owner is some big shot from the city," whispered Sarah, a petite server with auburn hair. "But they're keeping it all very hush-hush." Marcus rolled his eyes at the gossip. He had his own opinions about rich business owners, shaped by years of working in various restaurants where he'd seen how the wealthy often treated service staff. His last job at a casual dining chain had ended when he couldn't hold his tongue against a customer who had berated a busboy for a minor spill. That evening, as Marcus prepared the dining room for service, Mrs. Reynolds, the restaurant's strict manager, called everyone for the daily pre-service meeting. "Remember," she said, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, "Le Maison d'Or represents excellence. We serve many important guests, and each one deserves our absolute best." Marcus listened half-heartedly while polishing a wine glass. He prided himself on providing excellent service, but he also had strong beliefs about right and wrong. Growing up in a working-class family in Queens, his parents had taught him to stand up for his principles, though sometimes he took this too far. The dining room slowly began to fill with the evening's first guests. Marcus moved efficiently between his tables, his white gloves gleaming as he served dishes with perfect precision. He had mastered the art of fine dining service through years of practice, working his way up from small diners to upscale restaurants. "Marcus," Mrs. Reynolds called him aside during a brief lull, "your service skills are impressive, but I've noticed you can be judgmental of certain guests." She gave him a pointed look. "Remember, we leave our personal opinions at the door." He nodded politely but thought to himself how easy it was for others to ignore the things that mattered. Just last week, he had seen a guest make inappropriate comments to one of the female servers, and no one had said anything. Marcus had wanted to speak up but held his tongue, remembering he needed this job. The evening continued smoothly as Marcus served wealthy businessmen, celebrities, and politicians. He maintained his professional demeanor, though he couldn't help but form opinions about each guest based on their behavior and conversations. Near the end of his shift, Marcus overheard an interesting conversation between Mrs. Reynolds and Robert. "The new owner might be visiting soon," Mrs. Reynolds whispered, looking nervous. "We need everything to be perfect." Robert nodded seriously, but Marcus simply continued his work. He didn't care who owned the restaurant as long as they treated the staff fairly. Little did he know, his next shift would test his professionalism in ways he never expected, and his strong political views would soon collide with the reality of his workplace in a most unexpected way. As Marcus finished his closing duties that night, straightening chairs and replacing linens, he had no idea that tomorrow would bring a challenge that would change his perspective forever. The golden walls of Le Maison d'Or held many secrets, and the biggest one was about to walk through its doors. Marcus returned to table 15 with the wine list, his steps deliberately slow. He held the leather-bound menu by its edges as if it were something unpleasant, extending it toward Trump without making eye contact. "Here's our wine selection," he said flatly, breaking the restaurant's usual protocol of presenting the list with both hands and a slight bow. Trump was in the middle of discussing a new building project when Marcus interrupted him. "Excuse me, but have you decided on your wine?" Marcus asked loudly, cutting off Trump's conversation with his guests. The Secret Service agents shifted uncomfortably, and one of Trump's dinner companions raised an eyebrow at the waiter's rudeness. "Give us a few more minutes," Trump replied politely, seemingly unaffected by Marcus's behavior. "We're just finishing an important discussion." Instead of stepping away as proper service etiquette would require, Marcus lingered awkwardly by the table, pretending to adjust the silverware while eavesdropping on their conversation. Sarah passed by again, shooting Marcus a warning look. She could see what he was doing, allowing his personal feelings to affect his service. But Marcus ignored her silent warning. When he heard Trump mention something about luxury apartments, he couldn't help but mutter under his breath, "Like we need more expensive buildings in this city." One of Trump's guests, a woman in a designer suit, heard the comment and frowned. Trump himself was focused on the wine list and hadn't noticed, but the tension at the table was growing. Mrs. Reynolds, watching from across the dining room, began to fidget with her pearl necklace nervously. When Trump finally tried to order a prestigious California Cabernet, Marcus interrupted again. "Oh, that wine is actually quite inferior," he said dismissively. "Perhaps someone at your table who knows more about wine should make the selection." The insult was subtle but clear. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Trump looked up at Marcus for the first time, studying him with curiosity rather than anger. "You seem to have strong opinions about wine," Trump said calmly. "What would you recommend?" Instead of providing a professional recommendation, Marcus pointed to the cheapest wine on the list with a smirk. The dinner ordering process wasn't any smoother. When Trump requested his steak medium rare, Marcus barely wrote it down, acting distracted and uninterested. He accidentally knocked over Trump's water glass while reaching across the table unnecessarily, causing water to splash onto Trump's sleeve. "My apologies," Marcus said, without any real sincerity in his voice. He dabbed at the spill half-heartedly with a napkin, making it worse rather than better. Trump quietly used his own napkin to dry his sleeve, maintaining his composure despite the clear disrespect being shown. Throughout the evening, Marcus's behavior became increasingly unprofessional. He served the appetizers from the wrong side, forgot to bring bread to the table, and responded to every request with a slight roll of his eyes. When Trump asked for fresh ground pepper, Marcus pretended not to hear him for several minutes. The other servers watched in horror as Marcus continued his subtle campaign of poor service. Robert tried to step in once, offering to take over the table, but Mrs. Reynolds stopped him. She watched the situation unfold with an unreadable expression on her face, making notes in her small black notebook. What Marcus didn't notice, focused as he was on his own small acts of rebellion, was that Trump's response remained consistently professional and calm. Each time Marcus showed disrespect, Trump responded with patience. When Marcus brought the wrong wine by mistake, Trump simply smiled and waited for the correct bottle. As the main course approached, Marcus's attitude had created such an obvious tension that even guests at nearby tables had begun to notice. The usually smooth and elegant atmosphere of Le Maison d'Or was disturbed by his behavior, like ripples in a formerly calm pond. Little did Marcus know, his next decision, to serve Trump's carefully requested medium-rare steak well done, would push the situation to its breaking point. The consequences of his actions were about to catch up with him in a way he never expected. The kitchen at Le Maison d'Or buzzed with activity as Marcus pushed through the swinging doors. He carried Trump's perfectly cooked medium-rare steak in his hands, but a defiant gleam shone in his eyes. Instead of delivering it to the table, he placed it under the heating lamps. "What are you doing?" asked Chef Pierre, his French accent thick with concern. "That steak is ready to serve." But Marcus pretended not to hear, busying himself with other tasks while the meat continued to cook under the hot lights. 10 minutes passed, and the beautiful pink center of the expensive steak turned completely gray. Sarah, who was preparing her own table's orders, watched in disbelief. "Marcus, you can't serve that," she whispered urgently. "It's not just unprofessional, it's deliberately ruining a guest's meal." Marcus picked up the now well-done steak, arranging it carefully on the plate. "Oops," he said with fake innocence. "Guess I got distracted." Chef Pierre threw his hands up in frustration but couldn't stop Marcus as he headed back to the dining room. When Marcus placed the overcooked steak in front of Trump, the businessman looked at it with surprise. "I believe I ordered this medium rare," Trump said quietly, cutting into the gray meat. The woman beside him frowned at the obvious mistake. "Oh, did you?" Marcus replied with fake confusion. "My mistake. Would you like me to take it back?" But his tone suggested he had no intention of actually correcting the error. Trump's dinner companions exchanged uncomfortable glances. Mrs. Reynolds, who had been watching the situation unfold all evening, started walking toward the table. But before she could reach it, Marcus managed to create even more chaos. As he refilled water glasses, he accidentally knocked over a bottle of red wine, sending it spilling across the white tablecloth. The expensive Cabernet spread across the table like a crimson tide, threatening to drip onto Trump's suit. The Secret Service agents stepped forward, but Trump calmly raised his hand to stop them. He grabbed his napkin quickly, preventing the wine from reaching his clothes. "Let me help you with that," Marcus said, dabbing at the spill with napkins in a way that only made it worse. He was spreading the stain rather than containing it, and his actions seemed deliberately clumsy. Other guests in the restaurant had stopped eating to watch the scene unfold. Robert rushed over with fresh tablecloths and began damage control, but Marcus wasn't finished. As he cleared away the soiled linens, he started humming a protest song that had recently been used at anti-Trump rallies. The tune was quiet but clearly recognizable. Trump's female companion finally spoke up. "Is there perhaps another server available?" she asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. But Marcus quickly replied before anyone else could intervene. "I'm afraid all our other servers are quite busy," he said, knowing it was a lie. "You'll just have to put up with me." He emphasized the word "put up" in a way that made his meaning clear. He was enjoying making their dinner uncomfortable. The tension in the private dining section had reached a breaking point. Other guests were whispering among themselves, and several had complained to Mrs. Reynolds about the disruption to their expensive evening. The restaurant's elegant atmosphere had been completely shattered by Marcus's behavior. Trump, however, remained surprisingly composed. He continued trying to discuss business with his companions, though the conversation was repeatedly interrupted by Marcus's intrusions. Each time the waiter appeared, everyone at the table tensed, wondering what would happen next. As the evening progressed, Marcus's actions grew bolder. He began making subtle political comments while serving, suggesting that some people had more money than sense, and questioning the taste of anyone who would gold-plate a building. Each remark was carefully worded to stay just on the edge of what might get him fired. What Marcus didn't realize was that his next action, refusing to bring the dessert menu when requested, would finally push the situation past its tipping point. The consequences of his evening of deliberate disrespect were about to catch up with him in a way he never expected. The evening at Le Maison d'Or had reached its breaking point. After refusing to bring the dessert menu, Marcus stood with his arms crossed, a defiant expression on his face as Trump finally set down his napkin and looked up at him directly. "Young man," Trump said calmly, "I'd like to speak with the manager." His tone was firm but controlled, showing none of the anger that Marcus had been trying to provoke all evening. The other guests at the table had stopped pretending to enjoy their meal and were watching the scene unfold. Marcus let out a short, dismissive laugh. "I'm sorry, but the manager isn't available right now." He lied, even though Mrs. Reynolds was clearly visible across the dining room. "Perhaps you could leave a comment card?" His sarcasm was obvious, and several nearby diners gasped at his rudeness. Trump's dinner companions exchanged worried glances. The woman in the designer suit opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, Robert appeared suddenly at Marcus's side. The senior server's face was pale, and his hands were shaking slightly. "Marcus," Robert whispered urgently, "we need to talk. Right now." But Marcus shrugged him off, determined to maintain his stance of disrespect. He had come too far to back down now, or so he thought. "Whatever it is can wait," Marcus said loudly. "I'm busy serving our distinguished guests." He practically spat out the word distinguished, making it sound like an insult. The Secret Service agents shifted uncomfortably, their hands moving closer to their earpieces. Robert grabbed Marcus's arm, his grip surprisingly firm. "No, it really can't wait," he insisted, his voice trembling. "There's something you need to know about Mr. Trump and this restaurant." For the first time that evening, Marcus felt a flicker of uncertainty. He had never seen Robert look so serious. The usual cheerful glint in the older server's eyes was replaced with genuine fear. "What are you talking about?" Marcus asked, lowering his voice slightly. He noticed that Mrs. Reynolds was now walking quickly toward their table, her heels clicking against the marble floor with unusual urgency. Robert leaned in close to Marcus's ear and whispered something that made all the color drain from the young waiter's face. Marcus's eyes widened in shock, and his confident posture crumbled instantly. He looked at Trump again, but this time with dawning horror. He's the," Marcus stammered, unable to complete the sentence. Mrs. Reynolds had reached the table now, and she nodded grimly, confirming his worst fears. Trump wasn't just another wealthy guest. He was the restaurant's new owner. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. Every snide comment, every deliberately poor service choice, every act of disrespect had been directed not just at a customer, but at his actual employer. His dream job, the position he had worked so hard to achieve, was surely over. Trump watched the color drain from Marcus's face with what appeared to be genuine interest. Instead of the anger Marcus expected, Trump's expression showed something closer to curiosity. The businessman leaned back in his chair, studying the now trembling waiter. "So," Trump said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "now that we all know who everyone is, perhaps we should have a real conversation." He gestured to an empty chair at the table, an invitation that made Marcus's knees weak. The other diners in the restaurant had gone completely silent, watching the scene with intense interest. The crystal chandeliers seemed to sparkle more brightly, highlighting the dramatic moment unfolding beneath them. Marcus stood frozen, his earlier defiance replaced by pure panic. His career in fine dining, his reputation in the restaurant industry, everything he had worked for hung in the balance. And it all depended on what would happen next in this conversation with the man he had spent the entire evening disrespecting. Marcus slowly lowered himself into the chair Trump had offered, feeling as if he were moving through a dream. The fine dining room of Le Maison d'Or seemed to spin around him. Mrs. Reynolds and Robert stood nearby, both looking as nervous as Marcus felt. "Everyone, please give us a moment," Trump said to his dinner companions and the staff. They quickly stepped away, though the Secret Service agents remained at a respectful distance. The other diners pretended not to watch, but their attention was clearly focused on the unexpected scene. Trump folded his hands on the table and looked directly at Marcus. "So, you've had quite a lot to say tonight," he began, his voice surprisingly calm, though mostly through actions rather than words. "Why don't we change that?" Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely. The weight of his actions throughout the evening pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. I should start by apologizing," Marcus finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. But Trump raised his hand to stop him. "Before you apologize, I'd like to tell you a story," Trump said, reaching for his water glass. "Back in 1968, I worked as a waiter myself at a small restaurant in Queens." This revelation caught Marcus by surprise. He had never imagined Trump working in food service. "The owner was a tough man named Mr. Sullivan," Trump continued, "and I didn't agree with many of his business practices. One day, I served him poorly on purpose, just like you did with me tonight." A slight smile crossed Trump's face at the memory. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his fear mixing with curiosity. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the table as Trump continued his story. "Instead of firing me, Mr. Sullivan taught me something valuable. He said that in business and in life, you'll often deal with people whose views differ from yours. The true test of character is how you handle those differences." Trump paused to let his words sink in. In the background, the regular sounds of the restaurant had resumed. The gentle clink of silverware, the murmur of conversations, the pop of wine corks. But at their table, time seemed to stand still. "Sir, I know I acted terribly," Marcus began, but Trump wasn't finished. "You're clearly good at your job when you want to be," Trump observed. "I watched you serve other tables perfectly while deliberately providing poor service to mine. That takes skill, even if it was misused." Marcus felt his face grow hot with shame. Everything Trump said was true. He had deliberately used his professional skills to show disrespect. "What you may not know," Trump continued, "is that I bought this restaurant because it represents excellence in service. Everyone here takes pride in their work, treating each guest with respect regardless of who they are. Well, almost everyone." He gave Marcus a meaningful look. To Marcus's surprise, Trump then shared stories about his early days in real estate, times when he had to serve people he disagreed with, and how he learned to separate personal feelings from professional responsibilities. "The world of business, like this restaurant, runs on mutual respect," Trump explained. "Without it, everything falls apart. You can disagree with someone's views while still treating them with dignity." As Trump spoke, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The man sitting across the table wasn't just a political figure from TV anymore. He was a real person sharing genuine life experiences. "Now," Trump said, leaning back in his chair, "you have a choice to make. Not about your job. That decision will depend on how you move forward from this moment. The real choice is about who you want to be as a person." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Marcus realized that this conversation wasn't going the way he had expected. Instead of anger and punishment, he was being offered something much more valuable, a chance to learn and grow. Marcus sat in silence for a long moment. Trump's words echoing in his mind. The elegant dining room of Le Maison d'Or continued its evening service around them, but Marcus barely noticed. He was lost in thought, reflecting on his actions throughout the night. Memories of each deliberate act of disrespect now played back in his mind like scenes from an embarrassing movie. The overcooked steak, the spilled wine, the rude comments, all of it seemed childish now. Marcus remembered how his parents had raised him to judge people by their actions, not their positions or politics. "I've been completely unprofessional," Marcus finally admitted, his voice steady despite his shame. "Not just tonight, but in my thinking. I let my personal opinions affect how I treated another human being." The words felt strange coming from his mouth, but they were true. Trump nodded, taking a sip of water. "You know what impressed me most tonight?" he asked, surprising Marcus. "Even when you were being deliberately difficult, your technical service skills were perfect. Your timing, your knowledge of the menu, your attention to detail, all excellent." Marcus hadn't expected compliments. He looked down at his hands, noticing they were no longer shaking. "I worked really hard to develop those skills," he said quietly. "Years of training, starting from small diners, learning every aspect of fine dining service." "And yet," Trump continued, "you were willing to throw all that training away to make a point. Tell me, did it feel satisfying? Did poor service and disrespect change anyone's mind about anything?" The question hit Marcus hard. He thought about how he felt during each small act of rebellion. A momentary satisfaction had always been followed by a nagging sense of shame, a feeling that he was betraying his own professional standards. "No," Marcus answered honestly. "It didn't change anything. It just made me feel smaller." He looked around the beautiful restaurant, at the other servers providing impeccable service to their guests. "I became exactly what I claimed to be against, someone who judges and disrespects others without knowing them." Sarah passed by their table, carrying a tray of desserts. She gave Marcus an encouraging smile, and he realized how his behavior had affected his colleagues too. They had watched him compromise the restaurant's reputation, making their jobs harder in the process. "You know," Trump said, straightening his tie, "in business, I've dealt with people who completely opposed my views. Some became valuable partners once we found common ground in professionalism and mutual respect." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Success isn't about agreeing with everyone. It's about working together despite differences." Marcus thought about his own career goals. He had always dreamed of running his own restaurant someday. How could he expect to lead others if he couldn't separate his personal feelings from his professional duties? "I understand now," Marcus said, sitting up straighter. "Real strength isn't in showing disrespect or trying to prove a point. It's in maintaining your professionalism and treating everyone with dignity, regardless of your personal views." Trump smiled slightly, seeing the genuine realization in Marcus's eyes. "That's a lesson some people never learn," he said. "And speaking of lessons, would you like to know what happened with Mr. Sullivan, my old restaurant boss?" Marcus nodded eagerly, curious about how Trump's own story had ended. But before Trump could continue, Mrs. Reynolds approached the table with concern written on her face. Other guests were waiting to speak with Trump, and the evening was growing late. As Trump prepared to rejoin his dinner companions, Marcus felt a profound shift in his perspective. The evening had started with him feeling righteous in his disrespect, but it was ending with a humbling lesson in professionalism and human dignity. 2 months had passed since that eventful night at Le Maison d'Or, and the restaurant had changed in subtle but significant ways. The crystal chandeliers still sparkled overhead, the gold leaf ceiling still gleamed, but there was something different in the atmosphere, a renewed sense of professional pride that touched every aspect of service. Marcus stood at his usual station, adjusting his bow tie as he prepared for another evening of service. To everyone's surprise, Trump hadn't fired him that night. Instead, he had done something unexpected. He had made Marcus the example of a larger lesson for the entire staff. "Excellence in service," Mrs. Reynolds announced during their daily pre-shift meeting, "is what Marcus demonstrated last night with Table 12. The other servers nodded in agreement. Marcus had just finished serving a group of politicians whose views he personally disagreed with, providing them with impeccable, respectful service that drew praise from the entire dining room. The story of his confrontation with Trump had become something of a legend among the staff, though not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of being a cautionary tale about disrespect, It had transformed into a story about growth and professionalism. Sarah approached Marcus with a warm smile. "Table 15 is asking for you specifically," she said. "They heard about your service from their friends last week." Marcus nodded, knowing that his reputation had changed completely. He was now known for his exceptional service to all guests, regardless of who they were. As he worked through the evening, Marcus remembered Trump's final words to him that night 2 months ago. "Mr. Sullivan, my old boss," Trump had said, "became my first business mentor. He taught me that sometimes our greatest lessons come from our biggest mistakes. He saw potential in me, just as I see potential in you." The restaurant had become busier than ever, partly due to Trump's ownership becoming public knowledge, but mostly because of its renewed commitment to excellence. Marcus had played a key role in this transformation, sharing his story during staff training sessions. The real test of character, Marcus often told new servers, repeating Trump's words, "isn't in how we treat people we agree with, it's in how we treat those we don't." The phrase had become an unofficial motto of Le Maison d'Or. That evening, as Marcus served a table of international diplomats, he demonstrated the perfect balance of professional service and genuine respect that had become his trademark. His movements were graceful, his attention to detail impeccable, and his attitude consistently warm and professional. Mrs. Reynolds watched him work with pride. She remembered how close they had come to losing one of their most skilled servers that night. Instead, the incident had transformed not just Marcus, but the entire restaurant's culture. Trump himself visited the restaurant regularly now, often bringing business associates and family members. Each time he came, he made a point of requesting Marcus as his server. Their interactions had become a testament to how professionalism could bridge any divide. "You know," Trump said during his latest visit, as Marcus served him with perfect precision, "Mr. Sullivan would have been proud of how this turned out." The comment made Marcus smile, understanding now that great service was about more than just carrying plates and pouring wine. It was about human dignity. As the evening drew to a close, Marcus looked around the dining room with satisfaction. Every table told a story of different people, different beliefs, different backgrounds, all brought together by the simple dignity of excellent service. He had learned that true professionalism wasn't just about following rules. It was about respecting the humanity in everyone. The crystal chandeliers of Le Maison d'Or continued to sparkle overhead, but now they illuminated something more than just a luxury restaurant. They shone down on a place where lessons about respect, professionalism, and personal growth were served along with the finest cuisine in Manhattan. Marcus straightened his bow tie one last time that evening, ready to serve his final table. The gold-leaf ceiling reflected the warm light, much like his own transformation had reflected a deeper truth, that sometimes the greatest services we can offer are respect, dignity, and the willingness to grow beyond our own prejudices.